Ocular by Iniquity. Chapter 5. The first thing he became aware of was the confusing warmth of his feet. His feet had not been warm in a very long time. While it was an improvement, it was a strange one. One did not usually expect their extreme fevers to lead to warm feet. Maybe he was dead. He didn't feel dead. He imagined that being dead would result in him being less sore. Perhaps if he was currently dying, the least he could do first was establish the cause of his warm feet. He opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling of the tent. This further cemented the likelihood he was not dead. Surely the afterlife would have more impressive dwellings than his ragged living quarters. He felt better than he'd felt in a while, though. This was good. Dying would be a severe blow to the revolutionary cause and would have the worst effect of upsetting Lawrence. Where was Lawrence? He momentarily forgot about the status of his feet to focus on his fellow aide-de-camp. Washington had told him Lawrence was going to look after him. Washington was dooming him to the fate of being nursemaided like he was an infant and coddled like he was a rich child. Lawrence would get in trouble for taking extra food for him or something equally unnecessary. He would have to find the man to make sure he was not doing anything stupid on his behalf. He was improving just fine, which was clear, and he did not need any additional extra treatment. That Washington had dismissed him before the sun had even gone down in the dead of winter was embarrassment enough. He mentally listed out all of the places Lawrence could be and organized them in his head. With a grunt, he sat up, pulling Lafayette's coat tightly around him to protect against the chill. Lawrence was there. Lawrence was sleeping softly in his chair, his chest covered by one of their thin blankets. Where was Lawrence's coat? The thought of Lawrence being sick wrapped around his heart like a vice and crushed the breath out of him. Against his bidding, he thought of Lawrence laying in the sick tent, shivering and sweating. Lawrence's skin, pale and gray with fever, shining with sweat. Lawrence trying to vomit and nothing coming up. Lawrence with the pallor of a corpse. Their empty tent. A desperate sound squeezed itself unbidden from the pit of Alexander's stomach. Lawrence's eyes fluttered open. For a second, he cast Alexander a bewildered glance, and then his expression shifted into familiar fond annoyance.
Are you sure you cannot find some way to cover that awful thing? I had once thought it could look no worse than on that overdressed peacock, but you, as usual, have gone above and beyond your peers.
A little grin slid across his lips.
Where is your coat? Alexander asked without acknowledging the question. It will be no use to His Excellency if you are to catch a fever.
Lawrence frowned. It is protecting the man in this tent who has already caught a fever.
Alexander looked to see the coat in question wrapped firmly around his boots. It all made sense now. He had solved the mystery of the warm feet. If he was going to die, he could go now. Though he was not sure that possibility was not looming.
My dear, he said with a frown, there is no circumstance in which the comfort of my feet takes precedence over the very, very important activities in your chest cavity.
He reached down to unfold the jacket from his ragged boots. A familiar chill found his toes.
My chest appears to be functioning vastly better than any part of you, Hamilton. And given that I have been explicitly commanded to be your caretaker, it is well within my power to decide to give you my coat.
Lawrence sat back in his chair.
Do you know that I have mistaken you for Lafayette twice now? Imagine my surprise when I see our most decorated Frenchman asleep in our tent.
For a man's assigned caretaker, you seem to take great offense to my attempts to stay warm.
Alexander smirked at him.
Or are you merely jealous of the attentions the Marquis has bestowed upon me? I admit that I would be concerned if I wished to charm someone who was also viewed fondly by someone with such great power, wealth, and land.
He sat up a little straighter and shrugged himself properly into Lafayette's coat.
Ah, yes, a true and noble showing of French elegance, Lafayette said dryly. I find the clearest example of his good upbringing to be when he drinks too much wine and it dribbles down his face like a newborn.
It is true that he is a man of endless charm and wit. Like when he gets so upset he forgets what language he is speaking in, and it is only with great effort I can discern every second or third word in his newly created tongue.
How could I not be concerned if such a man is ingratiating himself with one of my charges?
They looked at each other for a long, silent moment. Then they both burst out laughing. Alexander took this opportunity to throw Lawrence's jacket back at him. The article hit the man square in the face, and, come by surprise, he nearly fell out of his chair.
A man possessing such rude manners could never be taught appropriately to fit in with such a family of high birth, like the noble Frenchman of Lafayette,
murmured Lawrence, but he put his coat back on without complaints. Alexander laid back down on the cot, being here with Lawrence, talking about nothing, feeling his charm wash over him. It was, in his esteemed opinion, the best remedy. He could feel it working at this very moment. Lawrence brought warmth into his life more than any coat. No one understood his troubles and plights better. Lawrence had laughed, and the light of his personality had banished the fever from his flesh. You would have to note his improvement to the general. He sat up again and concentrated on standing.
I presume that you would only be moving to your chair if you feel you are well enough to get up,
Lawrence said, his voice now serious. Alexander frowned and stood. Only a tinge of dizziness lingered on the edge of his consciousness.
I am feeling much better. Surely my nurse can see it would benefit our shared cause if I were to alert His Excellency. I will return immediately, pending he does not have further orders for me. Then I would love to hear all about the events of the days I have missed, and especially your goings-on.
What would most benefit our shared cause is for you to sit in your tent and rest. Especially because I am aware the general ordered you to stay in your tent and rest. I will tell you all about my goings-on now, if that is what you desire to hear. It has been quite busy with the upcoming battle. I am sure some of the details would interest you.
Lawrence's gaze was steady on him. Unsteadily, he picked up his chair and moved it in front of the tent opening and then sat down in it.
I do not ask me to alert the general for you, for I know you will simply take the opportunity to hide in Lafayette's quarters and work yourself to death.
It was true that there was little more that he wanted than to hear about the events of Lawrence's past few days, especially the ones that had escaped his own consciousness completely. But there was also the matter that he could put such a thing before keeping Washington updated on his status, and perhaps if he was lucky, the general would see he was well to receive orders. He knew, of course, that he was ill and that he would needed to be attended to, but he had been fine walking next to Lafayette's horse all morning. He did not need to be banned from going outside. Not when there was so much to do.
Do not be unreasonable with me, Lawrence. I am feeling perfectly capable to transcribe letters and create messages. I am not going to run off around the camp. I simply do not know what the upcoming messages are required, and I will go to the general and find out. Then I will return, and you may nursemaid me at your pleasure.
I am not the one in this tent being unreasonable, Hamilton. It is too cold for you to leave this tent.
Lawrence stood, which brought him a few inches taller than Alexander, his true height bowed by the low tent ceiling. Alexander could see a dark passion glowing in those eyes, along with all the other things about Lawrence that made his heart pound. Half of him was thoroughly irritated that his friend was in his way of working, but the other half of him could not help but admire that intensity and look for other ways to bring it to the forefront. Lawrence, in the middle of a passionate argument about anything, slavery, his health, or otherwise, was one of Alexander's favorite ways for him to be. Lawrence was even-keeled and contemplative and not prone to anger, but to see him so worked out, so full of energy and life, grew a dark heat in the pit of Alexander's stomach. To watch Lawrence's eyes glitter with conviction and an angry flush appear in the man's cheeks was a sight to behold. Alexander took a step forward. Lawrence's frown deepened into a scowl.
I will hold you down until you fall asleep in that cot if I have to, Alexander.
John, I am fine. I am certainly better than I have been in the past few days, and I do not need you lording over me like this. If anything, this kind of attention may worsen my health simply from me attempting to evade you.
Alexander!
Lawrence said, and his voice had a sharp, peculiar quality to it that Alexander could not immediately identify. It was as if he was about to make some dire proclamation. Anger had given him a flush in his cheeks, and his hands were clenched at his sides. His eyes gleamed in the dim light of the tent, and there was a tense muscle jumping in his jaw.
You do not know how sick you were. I watched you shudder and struggle for days. You did not see me when I went to Lafayette to deliver him a message, only to see your body draped over his saddle like he wanted to give you a proper burial. You do not know what I felt when the general told me you were struck by a vicious fever and needed to be out of the cold as soon as possible. To see you like that, in the middle of our march, in the middle of this godforsaken war, in this godforsaken weather, with barely our own coats and boots. It was like there was no more reason remaining for me to live. When I saw you there, I wasn't thinking about this cause, or the general, or my family, or anything. I thought you were dead, and I wanted to be dead too.
Alexander stared. He staggered back into his chair, unprepared and undefended from the force of the speech. Lawrence's expression was uncharacteristically intense, and his eyes were filled with remembered terror. Alexander could see how well Lawrence could recall that moment. He could imagine how he would feel had their positions been reversed. To see Lawrence's body thrown around like a burlap sack, motionless.
You cannot die on me, Alexander Hamilton.
Lawrence continued, and with a furious energy leaking into his voice, infusing the words with a strength Alexander was finding it difficult not to be overwhelmed with.
I will not let you do anything that will speed you towards that course. I will sit on your legs and wrap you in twine to keep you in this tent. I know how hard you work. Everyone knows how hard you work. But right now, you have to stop. If you don't stop, you will die. You will leave me alone. You will leave Washington, Lafayette, Eliza, all of us. Is that what you want? Are some pointless letters that anyone could write worth leaving me alone for?
John! Alexander went looking for his voice and found it missing. He would never say that he was not selfish or that he did not have ambitions to improve himself. Of course, his legacy was of the utmost importance. But something about how Lawrence laid down that information, something about his passion or his fury or the heartbreaking worry Alexander could hear buried there, it made him feel like a monster. John, he started again, and his voice was thick and weak all at the same time. I would never want to leave you alone. You bring light into my life. I am sorry to have upset you so deeply when you saw my body on Lafayette's saddle. Of course, it was not my intention to be there. Please do not mistake my intentions as acts with the goal to hurt you.
It doesn't matter what your intentions are, Lafayette continued, anger growing in the audible quiver in his voice. When you are dead, no one will say, well, it was not his intention to die, but he ran around in a bitter winter with a fever. No one will say, certainly he did not intend to cause abject agony to all who care for him, but what can be expected when one has a job to do?
He punctuated the last 3 words with a snarl.
They will say, you are dead, and you will be dead, you will be gone, and it will be me, Lafayette, and Mulligan at the bar. You will no longer be able to deliver a letter on Washington's behalf. You will leave your dear Eliza a widow, and for what? For this all-consuming obsessive pride in always working? For your addiction to improving your legacy? Your legacy will be a pointless death by an idiot who, despite his great brilliance and unending charisma, was too blind to listen to the messages sent to him by his body, by his friends, and by his commanding officer.
Alexander sat in silence. He felt cold, not only cold by the chill weather they were experiencing, but a cold which had sunk into his heart and crystallized the feeling there. He could not look at Lawrence. He stared at his boots and wiggled his toes, trying to direct his attentions away from a mysterious black mass growing in his chest. Despite all the things that he had intended to do, he could not see or think of anything but what Lawrence must have looked and felt like that first moment seeing his body on Lafayette's horse. This fever would not conquer him. He would not allow it to do so. He could not allow it to do so because of Lawrence. He started, and for all the words that had come so easily to him so many times, there was nothing for him here. His voice was barely above a hesitant whisper. I am sorry, my dearest. I did not mean to upset you so greatly. I will retire to my cot.
In the name of God and all that this revolution stands for, you certainly will.
Lawrence said savagely. Alexander lowered himself from the chair back to his cot and took the blanket that Lawrence offered him, pulling them around Lafayette's coat. The wintry cold did not reach him. It could not even consider punching through the viciousness of Lawrence's anger that already raged around him, making mincemeat of his flesh and freezing his blood to ice. He closed his eyes and tried not to think about Lawrence standing there, the furious rage swirling around him. He was the eye of his own storm. Alexander could not seek shelter there, not when he had already cast himself out of the refuge.